Good. So, Shini, over to you for introductions.
No, I didn't hear your beginning. It could be my audio.
Oh, can people hear me okay? Okay.
I think you were muted.
Shini, I don't know if you can hear me, but if someone else then maybe can speak if you can't hear me, and just say over to you to do the intro.
Oh yeah, thanks everyone for coming to this talk. So Dr. Bernie Hogan is the Senior Research Fellow at the OII, Oxford Internet Institute. He's a Senior Research Fellow and a Research Associate at the Department of Sociology. Dr. Hogan's research explores the creation, maintenance, and analysis of personal social networks with a particular focus on the relation between online and offline networks. There's especially how social networks and social media can be designed to empower people to build stronger relationships and stronger communities. Today's section will focus on the use of personal network approaches in teaching, pitfalls, and potentials. Networks, as we've studied in this course, are not mere manifestations of social structure, but selective representations. Who gets represented? How are they represented? And how this works within a classroom setting is an important and regular part of this conversation. So this talk discusses the specific issue of showing a social network in a classroom that includes people in the class. Dr. Hogan would articulate this approach as a microcosm of how to engage and dialogue about representing and feedbacking data to a class, as well as understanding how data inequality can be perpetuated. Dr. Hogan, it's all yours.
Oh, thank you very much, Jinyi, I believe, is it? Thank you. Gosh, that's a tall order for me. That's a lot to cover in an hour, and I'm only going to touch on some of this. I'm happy to name check some work of my own. I actually have some papers referenced in here on this. But I think before I get to the slides and all that, I always like to give a little bit of a couple-minute warm-up on this. Ideally on the motivations behind it. So when I first came to Oxford many moons ago, I had pivoted from work looking at personal networks in everyday life. And in everyday life, there's a lot of common issues, mainly with the provision of health or social support, how we maintain our connections with others. And I was doing this with personal network work where we tried to innovate a way to do this using pen and paper, because the prior ways of doing this were dreadfully boring. They were really, and in that boringness is both sort of an ethical issue and a methodological one. If it's really miserable and unpleasant, when you're asking people questions about their friends and family, well, number one, they may be suspicious. They may be reticent. We know this academically in terms of what's called panel conditioning or strategic withholding. So it had been my goal in my work, often broadly, even up to today, to find ways to both increase the methodological quality of data collection from networks, but also to conceptualize it and reconceptualize that relationship in a more sociological way that includes notions of power. Now that became very, very real for me in around 2015. When I first started here around 2008, yeah, I've been here that long. When I first started in 2008, so I pivoted from that to downloading Facebook networks, and that's where we're gonna start and showing these Facebook networks around 2015. Those networks were no longer available, and so I'll get into the story of how that happened as we go along, but it meant to pivot in my own work and to think, should I be doing work with digital networks where we sort of slurp up the data in some way and do some analysis with it, or how else can I apply my work? At that time, I was very fortunate that I had worked with a graduate student, Joshua Melville, who is now and people in Northwestern University. And so they were looking for a way to do this stuff digitally that could scale up. Josh was doing it digitally and was looking for funding to help support his work. So you put the two together, bada bing, bada boom, you've got, opportunities. Those opportunities became Network Canvas, which is now really great software. I think it's just really the bee's knees for some tasks, and I use it in my class. before then, and actually the genesis of Northwestern coming to me was the fact that they were using my prior tool to visualize their own Facebook networks, and they were using this in a study, and they realized that the guy who does the pen and paper stuff and the guy who does the Facebook network stuff was the same guy, and so they're like, we should do this. But now those Facebook networks that we did, I'll show one now in a second. Here, let's share my screen. To give you a kind of a sense of it, it's not exactly how it looks in the UX, but I think it'll get the job done. Okay, so now if I do this, it's going to darken my second screen, and I'm not enjoying that. So if it's possible, I am going to do this, and this should still be enough screen space for everyone. I'm assuming it should be legible and all that. And also because I want to flip through a couple different applications to show you what we're doing. Okay, so I'll go to this one first, and this is the one that I show in just about every talk I give. This is my personal network, and it was my personal network in 2008. It's one of the first ones I visualized using the Facebook API. To some extent, it's a matter of a privilege in a way, because I knew people at Facebook who supplied me with some pretty tricky queries that allowed me to collect this data adequately. And so that was quite fortunate. At the time, Facebook had made available this sort of ways of doing networks. And so Joshua and I built an application called NameGenWeb, which allowed people to just like one click visualize their network. And it looked kind of like this. It was an evolution of that. And within that evolution, we found that it became very popular in classrooms. That in fact, about 40 classrooms around the world in teaching networks, this was like the exercise they would do on their first day. They would say, go visualize your Facebook network, and this helps you articulate or get a sense of networks, because if you're in the network and you know these people, it's your history, and that makes a lot of sense, and that's a way of sort of translating this. But that data, like I said, was no longer available. In the end, by the time we had stopped, 35,000 unique users had downloaded and or visualized over 200,000 networks using our software. So there's a lot of people looking at a lot of networks. It's also a lot of data. Now, we deleted all that data. That was part of our privacy policy. We did not. There's no Oxford Analytica. I mean, we had the same kinds of data. Like I said, we had, if you have 35,000 people's networks, and each of those networks can have a couple hundred people, we had data on millions of people. A lot of people ask, why don't you keep that data and use it for analysis and stuff? And that misunderstood what we were trying to do. The goal of this work for me was not to extract networks to analyze them and then speak back to others. The goal was to find reasonable ways to project a set of relationships to someone else so that they could see their network. And we know that this sort of letting someone see their network is a powerful thing. And in fact, Facebook itself believes it's a powerful thing. If you've ever been to their offices, they use this as like a screensaver, or they've got it in mouse pads and stuff. Now, the quote at the bottom of this is rather, I don't know, sanguine, perhaps. It says, when I shared this image with others within Facebook, it resonated with many people. It's not just a pretty picture. It's a reaffirmation of the impact we have in connecting people, even across oceans and borders. Wow. What a time 12 years ago was, and how earnest they could be about this. But also, every selection is an exclusion. What are you not seeing on this map? China, Russia, Sub-Saharan Africa? This is not the world. This is Facebook's perspective on the world. And there's a sufficient amount of world there that we can acknowledge it as the world, but there's also an insufficient amount of the world to acknowledge that Facebook isn't the world, even if it's trying to frame itself in that way. But nevertheless, there is still the running sense that it's useful or positive. Okay, so now going down to the next slide, just a reminder for people. The social network of human beings, it's an inferred, constructed object. It has no independent existence, and thus is always subject to interpretation. In these cases, the use of the term network is that of a model or metaphor. It does not denote an unambiguous object, but a perspective. It's really important. The world, and this is, I come from somewhere between postmodernism and pragmatism, and in that I have leanings for like William James's radical empiricism, the notion that everything out there is real and is to be considered within our analysis, but also that these things are indeed selected and constructed. The phenomena that exists in the world has to be encoded in some way. We just do that as humans. And so we have to be reflexive of that encoding. And part of this work is asking who is doing the encoding and how. Now, I'm not going to get too technical in this talk, but I do want to sort of marinate a little bit of networks here. This is as much as we'll get with this, to give you a sense of how we construct that data and representing network data. We can do it in a couple different ways. I've used some rather I've kind of evolved the names that I use. I will say these are older names that I use. So normally it's we have dot and cam in there to represent more non-binary people, but I guess yeah, it's a kind of reused old slides, as it were. But the important thing here is that we can either think of this as an adjacency matrix, as a from and to. We can think about this as, say, all the messages from Alice sent to other people. So it can either be a 1 or a 0, or we can make it weighted, or we can make it positive and negative if we're talking about, affect. This is often how it's used in, say, machine learning or in an algorithm. These matrices, when you have it in a matrix, you can do lots of neat things with it in order to get metrics. This is how we would normally see it or conceptualize it. We often think of these things as sociograms, and most of what I'll be doing today is showing sociograms and talking about them. But you can also think of it in terms of edge lists, and these are what comes down from Facebook or from other sites. This would be a list of people and their friends, this one and friend 1 and friend 2 and friend 3. And you feed this edge list into an algorithm or a network package, and it converts this into a network object, which you can then represent as like this. And the representations tend to show kind of coherent patterns, and different kinds of networks show coherent patterns. The most, I guess, common patterns that we like to show now, if we can go back up here, are what would be referred to as community detection. That in itself is already a loaded concept, and it's not merely loaded because of the term community. We understand that this does not refer to a community in kind of the sort of classic sense, or Benedict Anderson Imagine community, or Barry Wellman and like personal communities. They're just groups where there's more nodes within than there is between. But in doing so, you kind of get different clusters of people, and those clusters are intelligible. But the real reason I said it's, contested is because it's already implying that what we ought to do is partition our network into discrete categories. Showing overlapping communities is challenging, but it still represents the world. Nevertheless, this is a sort of an information reduction technique, tends to do enough for people that they go like, wow, that's my network. And oh yeah, that is family, and that is undergrad, and so forth. We also get to see these sorts of brokerage relationships. These are people that may actually be in different communities. We see this person right here. This was my significant other at the time. And you can tell that's just my significant other if you can acknowledge, if you kind of read these diagrams, because they are not only connected to this context, but linked to some people from family, linked to some people from high school and graduate school. And that tends to be what happens with people we are close to. We, have multiple contexts in which we know them. And it's actually a pretty long-standing feature in networks called multi-strandedness, that the more context we know people, often the closer we are with them. Now, the causal direction is subject to discussion, but it's a correlational thing. But what I don't want to do is assert that our goal is to just split the world up into different groups. I don't think that that's very healthy, but I do think it does help as an information reduction technique as a first pass. Okay, so, and there's different kinds of networks we can think of. There's just tons of them, but here's some general ones here that I'll be mentioning later on. The first is a whole network. A whole network can be either nominalist or realist. Either we can define the boundary, we say everyone who uses a hashtag, or it can be a realist boundary. A classroom is a classic quintessential example of a realist boundary. We say everyone in the class. But interestingly, already there's something implied there. When we say everyone in the class, we almost always just mean the students. We're not referring to the TA. We're not referring to the teacher or the instructor. We're assuming that the class is the students, and that's already creating a boundary and creating a sense of hierarchy in there. And that can, for me, be a bit problematic, because what we're already assuming is we're creating as an analytical object the class that we are distinct from. That gives people the temptation to survey, to think of it from above, and we'll show how that plays out later. The second is a partial network. That's where we maybe do snowball sampling or kind of scrape around the web, but you can't download all the web. So we do have practical limits. In my own work, I tend to do a lot of work with ego networks. And so these would be example of 5 different ego networks right here. And then this one right here is 2-mode networks, things like actors going to different parties. Now, everyone here has experienced 2-mode networks, I'm almost certain, in the sense of this is very commonly used as people who bought this product bought that product. And so vast databases of 2-mode networks get reduced in a way to say that, everyone who, I don't know, buys a book on, computer programming, buys another book on computer programming or something. Maybe someday they'll buy mine. I have one coming out at the end of the year, but can't say too much about it now. It's still in press. So within these different sort of network types, we have different ideas and ways we can construct an analytical object. Now, one of the things about that is that those in power would prefer if we don't think of these as separate analytical objects, but impose a kind of unitary identity on everyone that simplifies the world and makes it easier to think of the world as a network. And I want to feature that with this quote that I think is quite vulgar from Mark Zuckerberg back in the day. This was at the F8 conference in, I believe, 2009. And this is what was asserted on Facebook was that sites where you use a pseudonym or where you hide behind a pseudonym are terrible, and they're full of trolls, and they're nasty, and they're 4chan, etc. Facebook is the place where you have your real identity. It's your true identity, and thus you should be here. You should use your real name, and thus the network that you produce through Facebook is a real network. Now, there's a lot of problems with that already. And those problems were identified in a piece, among others, well, one of my favorites that I've been a part of by Liz McConnell and colleagues. And this is some work done at the Institute for Sexual and Gender Minority Health and Wellbeing at Northwestern University. So those are the people that also build NetCanvas that I've been working with for, gosh, almost 10 years now on stuff. But this paper from Liz, what they did is they got, similar to my Facebook network, they used my tool to download 160 odd networks of young LGBTQ persons. And then those persons labeled each of those groups. You see they're like different little colors here, just determined through community detection. And maybe they labeled one as family, one as neighbors, one as friends. And we took all those labels and we interpreted things with them. For what it's worth, in this paper, we also asked them about their out status, because if you are a member of a sexual or gender minority, there is the reality of having to come out, as people have sort of assumptions, and then you have to like work against them. I experience this every day when if someone asks what my wife does, and say she presents as male because she's gay, and she's not she. But nevertheless, outness can vary considerably. Some people are out to everybody. Some people are not out to anybody. Some people are out to everyone but family, and some people are only out to their family. So these are 4 different clusters here. Now, what we did is we looked at those networks and reduced them to their different communities. And we found that the patterns of connectivity varied by outness, that people who were not out, that they had these they had very few links between the school, high school, and family. They tried to avoid, they tried to partition their network, and that was evident in the actual network structure, where they would try to, like, you wouldn't see links between friends and family. They didn't, like with my former partner, they didn't introduce their partner to their family or their partner to high school. They kept things very separate. Now, this was seen through these networks, but also seen through quotes and as lived experience. So here's an example here. You know, I use this account to manage multiple pages. One is for my drag persona. This account has received some negative feedback from more conservative family and friends. They found the overt sexual references and bold personality of a drag show and pictures of it, videos of performance, other marketing materials, they're somewhat offensive. So I added them to a limited visibility privacy group I created to keep people who feel this way from seeing my raunchier posts. Fair play. Since someone else here, and this is a Black cisgender female, she's lesbian. She says, you know, I use it for talking to my friends, maintaining a relationship, and I'll eventually get a separate page for my family to add me on. I just feel bad about having the need to create a second page simply for talking to my family, because many of them don't accept my true being. That is, me being happily gay and seeing other people. Embracing and accepting that part of myself so openly sometimes upsets them. So this account is the only place I can express myself freely. So I'm eliciting those to indicate that simply because we can get a network doesn't mean that we're getting an identity. And just because we get an identity doesn't mean we're getting the full picture of a person. But also to illustrate that we can do that actually through collecting the network and enliven this data. We're not just getting experiences from people, but we're seeing how that looks in a more sort of 40,000-foot view. Now, what happens when we, instead of just interviewing them, but thinking about what we do with that in the classroom? So, you know, there's two kind of broad approaches to networks in the classroom. We might say personal networks and whole networks. So those were what I had shown up earlier here. This is a whole network. You might think of the class, and these are personal networks. Now, whole network studies tend to happen through a survey or type of approach where we would get people to nominate who else they regard in the class. So we get every student, and then we ask those students, who's your friend? And they can nominate up to X friends, often like 5 or 6. A researcher would compile all those. So the students are not actually co-constructing this per se, they're more like up here. So we ask Alice, who are you friends with in the class? And then I get that data. And then I ask Bob, who are your friends in the class? And I get that data. And then what I do with it later is I produce a network. And then where does that go? Who does that get fed back to? Here's an example of that sort of work. This is the adolescent health data, AdHealth, and they had a network study. This is a highly segregated school in America. I don't know which school it is. It's known as COM16. It has been featured in many publications, but you will see here that it has a kind of that networky look. That networky look comes from a layout algorithm. And layout algorithms traditionally, as we might have implied from these up here, it takes people who are tied to each other and puts them closer together, and takes people who are not tied to each other and kind of pushes them apart. And as it does that with the coming together and the pushing apart, it tends to settle. And when it settles, that can reveal pockets or areas of groupiness. So what you'll notice here is this is almost like a linear sort of like thread. It's almost like my life course is kind of going through here from my family, high school, undergrad, grad school, professional. It might look a bit different than now, a little bit of crosstalk, but effectively that's it. And what do we see with these networks? We see significant levels of polarization. And you'll notice on the first one, top to bottom, these friendships here are by grade. We have over here, this is the grades, I think red is grade 7, purple is grade 8, then blue is grade 9, 10, 11, and 12. So, I mean, unsurprisingly, people in grade 12, I mean, they're like 17 or something, are not hanging out with people who are 12. So age-graded organization of this makes sense. We might also wonder, is there what we'd call homophily or similarity by gender. And over on the right-hand side, we can see that indeed there does appear to be kind of like pockets of this. And we've done a little analysis on this, and indeed there is some explanatory variance that comes from friendships by gender, where the boys are preferentially befriending boys and girls preferentially befriending girls. I say boys and girls rather than men and women, only due to the age involved here. But while that is apparent at the microstructure, at the macrostructure, gender is not the organizing principle. It is primarily age and also race. The school is heavily segregated, and that's really unfortunate. We see here a sort of a tragic distinction in the classroom, where we have, these are the students who I believe in this it's I can't remember if they use African American or Black and white or Caucasian. So I put an asterisk up here because while they, in this case in the 90s, coded this as race, they also include Latin Americans, Hispanic, and they also include Native American, Pacific Islanders. So there is some conflation of ethnicity and race, but I'm going to just park that and just consider this as an example. And similarly, the asterisk by gender is the fact that they weren't asking anyone about a non-binary status or any other sorts of androgynous, or people prefer not to say. So this is, we're already constructing categories and potentially underserving people with this sort of work. But one of the greatest ways in which we are underserving people is, imagine if you could identify yourself in this network. Imagine if you're this person. Imagine if you're that person. Imagine, I looked last night in preparation for this talk. I was just kind of curious. In networks, we have a notion of in degree and out degree. In degree is how many nodes come to me, and out degree is how many friendships I would send out, how many friendship nominations. And we had 31 people in here who have an in degree of 0. That means nobody nominated them. So while that may be a reality, it's also a difficult reality. And what do we do when we show that reality? What is the purpose of this network? Is this network to understand educational outcomes? And to that end, maybe the diagram is not relevant. This is for social scientists and demographers. But if we are to think of this as a reflection of the school back to itself, those who are on the periphery could be for any number of reasons. They could be, they just recently moved to the school, they were absent that day, there's missing data. As long as there also could be issues with conflict or undiagnosed mental health issues, which might need care. The reasons we just don't know. But if you can identify yourself in that, it's still, there is still a sense of this is not going to work for you. In networks, there is a algorithm. It's not exactly how the world works, but it's one called preferential attachment, where you can model a lot of large-scale and internet social systems using a kind of really simple logic. You probabilistically select ties based on how many, or a new friend based on how many friends they have. So it's like people preferentially will befriend the popular people. And then if you preferentially befriend the popular people and you run that over and over, what happens is that you get this steep distribution. And that's what we have online, where we have some very small number of very massive platforms that are winner take all, everybody linking to Amazon and everybody linking to Amazon, which is now 40% of e-commerce. And then, some websites that just don't get any links at all. And that's very extreme. And we don't normally see something that extreme in a classroom. But the issue is that we know that when we reveal a network to others, that people point to, they look to, who is the central person, and start attending to that. So now we may have revealed a level of inequality, and in revealing it, we don't ameliorate it, we exaggerate it. Oh, they're popular, must be for a reason, I should go check them out. Oh, look at that loser, I thought they were all right, but nobody nominated them. And so thus, this network as an intervention can actually work at cross purposes. So now, This has been the subject of a special issue in Social Networks, the journal, last year in 2021. I wrote a commentary in this journal, and it was based on a conference where I was a keynote at, and called REXNOW, or Recent Ethical Challenges in Social Network Analysis. Much of what I'm saying here, and in fact, later on we'll quote from that, but this is from Paula's article, and Paula, what she's saying here is, well, let's see, later research provides hard evidence of the issues we intuitively anticipated. She's revealed a network back to a firm, and then had some feedback from that. So, for example, Ryan et al., that's Louise Ryan, here is a UK scholar, interviewed highly skilled French professionals in London, many of whom appeared quite self-conscious about the visual representations of their personal networks. Those who thought of themselves as successful, confident networkers experienced a sense of unease when presented with, for example, a lack of diversity in their relationships. As a woman who described herself as cosmopolitan, but realized that her visual included almost only co-nationals, other people from her country. Their attitude betrayed a form of vulnerability, that of migrants whose relatively high economic status was not enough to ensure full integration. People became self-conscious of this when we represented that back. So, despite the fact that there is real attraction, and like I said, 35,000 people had, use this in the class, see your network. But depending on how you show that network and frame it, it's not just an insight, but also a way that we can, see parts of ourselves, which we may or may not like. But now, nevertheless, we remain a little undeterred, because I do think that if you focus this task appropriately, it can be meaningful. So before Facebook turned off the tap, we had myself with Christine Greenhow, Nicole Ellison, and Grace Gian. Grace is a postdoc, mainly writing the paper, and Nicole and Christine and I put the software together beforehand. And so this is in CSCW, but I just put the titles because, it's Google. Everyone can search the titles. What we did is we actually showed students their own networks. We built a program called College Connect. It was actually a pretty profound experience for myself, because we had used College Connect with students in relatively impoverished areas. If anyone has seen the movie 8 Mile, about Eminem's rise and, history as a rapper in Detroit, this was in 8 Mile. I went to schools that were run by the United Way, and we talked to the students there about their networks. It was indeed an impoverished area, and there were a lot of people who had not gone to college or didn't have support or know that they had support, but we believed that by exposing, or rather surfacing, their wider ties, not just the people that they know best, that reflection could then lead them to say, hey, I know someone who, went to that school or this school. Maybe I should have asked them, or I can ask them. So we were trying to think, not how can we do this thing right here where we extract the network as an object and make claims about it, but rather, how do we bring the network back to people, and for what purpose? And so within College Connect, we did this. Then Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, et cetera, a bunch of things happened. They said, no more friendship ties. So what was going to be a living application to actually help people surface those in their network that they might not have known otherwise ended up being like a very rushed lab study. And that was the end of it. Now, within that lab study, we, because of just the fact that we had a few months to actually do this before no more Facebook friends were available, we didn't have a huge N. But we did find significant differences in the people they nominated before they saw the tool, who tended to be like their guidance counselor, their best friend, and their mom. And then the people after the tool, where they were like, oh, this person went to Wayne State University, maybe I should ask them, or, oh, I didn't realize, Aunt so-and-so went to Oxford, and so that. And so then you see afterwards the people that they nominated were people they rated, there were different people that they rated with more expertise, more reliability, and actually they were slightly less close. So this is good. We're helping people to find their weak ties. But now that's one way of approaching ego nets, but there's many others as well. So now I'd like to introduce Network Canvas. And Network Canvas, the software, let me just sort of pull it up here. Here's Network Canvas Interviewer. This is an application. It's not a web application, so you can't really send this to someone. If you want to talk about how to run a Network Canvas study, that's another day. You feel free. But now here, let me show you what we did in the classroom, and this is the redacted demo. So here's an example of a, actually, before I do that, I will actually orient us with a kind of a very simple protocol right here. Protocol is kind of like the, between a browser and a web page, Network Canvas, and a protocol. So this is a demo protocol, and it shows things, and here's how we would nominate people. And I might say, you know, my, 80 barbcam.ellen. And so just nominating people and so forth. And then you can see how we're getting people to do this themselves. This is not the ties that we are kind of getting from communication media or whatever, but the ties that people find are themselves what they think of as the relevant ties. So connect any two people that might know each other without you there, and this. And so then people can create personal networks out of this, and then we, you know, we can then get some of this data, work with it, and you know, learn something about these sort of voluntary relationships, and etc. Now I'm going to get out of this demo interview then and show you that one that I meant to show before. So what did we do? Yeah, what did we do in class? So here's what we did in class. Whole network says ego and alter pairs. So we could say these would A, B, C, D, E. These would be names of the students in the class. This is a roster study. Now, of course, we don't have the names because they're my students, and this is, you know, it's, you know, GDPR, privacy, etc. I'm not telling you who's in my class. But we can take them and we can add them. And this says, please select only yourself. So I'll say I'm B for Bernie. And then now with the remainder, I can say, please select everyone you knew before coming to class. And I can do that. And now please select everyone you have met since class, and I can add those. And that can be my alter pool. So we can take those data, that's finished, they take it, and we unify that together and we create a network. So the question is, should we show it to the class? What challenges emerge when we do that? Now, what I have resolved lately is that I use a kind of, I don't show it to the class as raw data. We exclude a couple things. In the latest incarnation of this, here's some of the rules that we have put together. Rule number 1, if either I nominate you or you nominate me, we're going to keep an edge in there. But what we're not going to do is show the directedness of the edge. So in case I nominate you and you don't nominate me, that's not going to be exposed to the rest of the class. We're not going to know which of the two people made the nomination. The second thing is that while we have a roster of everyone in the class, if someone doesn't fill out the survey, we exclude their name entirely. So we don't show links from me to, say, Niall, if Niall didn't fill out that survey. We just take Niall out of that. And that way we only have voluntary consent of the people in the network. And then what we do is I show this network to the class. I use it as a way to talk about maybe change from one time to the other time. I've done this because in the past we have had challenges, of course, then revealing, like I said, what if you're the person who nominates people but is never nominated? Now this can create, you know, a sense of isolation, a sense of discomfort. In fact, in one class that I had done this work with, there was a student who, based on, it wasn't this, but what I did is I did a survey in the class, a getting to know you survey, and I got my data science students to render some distributions of the class. I said, everyone, we're going to fill out a survey, and then you only put in data that you want other people in this class to see, and then we give it to everybody, and then let's analyze it and see what we can do. And one of the students did an analysis by discipline. And they found that a lot of people had co-disciplines, sociology and statistics, or, anthropology and sociology, or economics and computer science, and so forth. And there was one student who had a discipline, which I won't say, but it was like a niche discipline, but still certainly welcome within the social data science program. But they were the only one with that discipline. And so the person who was doing the analysis was like, isn't this cool? I've made a network and here's the class and we can see most everyone's connected. Now the student of the single, and there was this one dot that was just like by themselves, and the rest of the class was a cluster. That student wasn't. That student was struggling a little bit in class, and I spoke with that student subsequently, and I said, I'm sorry about that. I didn't realize that was going to happen. And the student said, yeah. And if I may quote, I know this is recorded, but they said, and I quote, "It felt shit." Yeah, it felt shit, is what they said. That the other students didn't realize that, exposing this is actually exposing one student as an isolate. Now, me knowing a student is an isolate is an opportunity for intervention. Is for me to think, can I help students befriend in class? Can I put groups together? But the students revealing to each other that one is an isolate is enacting power, even when they're not realizing it. And so that for that reason, we've had to think more carefully than just, let's do a network in the class, throw it up, and see what we do. So those are the questions that I was sort of asking. How do you think it feels to be in the center of that network, or to be the one connecting across multiple groups? Maybe you feel like a broker. How does it feel to be on the periphery? And how does it feel to have an in degree of 0? And are you teaching the material, but in doing so, creating inequalities in that process? Now, this is certainly not the first time I do this, and I've had a birthday recently, and one thinks about their age when they during these things. This is me many moons ago, much less beard ago, I suppose. This is Brisbane. This is the summer doctoral program for the students, and what you see up here on the corner is this was the network that we did with the students there, and they were talking about these sort of links. Now the details of the network is unspecific, but the point is to say that I had been using this sort of technique for a very long time, trying to do this, and I had muddled through, and it wasn't really until I started thinking about power that I was able to refine some of the ways in which I think we ought to consider this. Up until that point, I was thinking about data accuracy. But accuracy of a constructed network is not the same thing as accuracy of the phenomenon. And the phenomenon, what is the purpose of the phenomenon versus the purpose of the network? We must reconsider and reassess. So this led to me thinking about this in terms of power, and writing this piece for social networks, which fell out pretty quickly, frankly. I was procrastinating on it a while, and I wasn't sure I could get it because I had been totally my head was in book writing mode. Just yesterday, I got back the proofs from said book. It's apparently 610 pages in Word. So for those of you trying to finish your DPhil, I know that feeling. But I did get nothing, nothing works like a deadline. So we did indeed. They got an article out of me, and I just want to read this right here. Now, the lead article in this special issue is by Jose Luis Molina and Steve Borgatti, both wonderful researchers. Steve got a book called Analyzing Social Networks, which is like a real classic text, and Jose Luis is one of the people in this book right here, Conducting Personal Network Research. And just like a delightful book. It was Chris's inspiration, Chris McCarty, but they're part of it. But this is their work on how ethics committees are moral bureaucracies, and really captivating idea there. So true as they said, none of these stories and stories that I'm describing heretofore, you've heard them over the course of the speech, came anywhere to the real horror stories of biological experiments. If anything, they represented faux pas, an overly trusting methodology, or as stated above, naive optimism. But they also hinted at something crucial in network studies that's rarely discussed and must be confronted in an issue on ethics: networks exact power. They enact power. Now, this is not power in the strictly domination sense, though it is always lurking in studies of power. This is power in the Foucaultian sense of how relations structure not only our sense of agency, but also our very conceptions of the self and of truth. In all of the papers collected herein, this is a special issue, is a meditation, either implicit or explicit, on how power is revealed through social network studies. To say power is revealed through network studies does not mean that we find the central powerful actor or note the powerful community. Sometimes we understand how our own power as academics is diminished when we try to look in the wrong places. Social media companies that curate social and personal information from the wider world do not always facilitate access to their social graphs. Yet they take our students, apply our methods, and optimize relations for their own ends. Twitter stands uniquely in this space as a medium that is both widely used and is relatively accessible as a public network, but it is a fraction of Facebook's size. And so, to resonate again with Molina and Borgatti, I wonder whether we, as relatively disempowered academics, steer towards Twitter as a path of least resistance. The same can be said for the profusion of studies in the classroom, where disempowered children and teenagers are less likely to see this approach as a uniquely relevant form of surveillance in the way that individuals would in firms or in everyday life. Doing these sorts of who you know studies in an office can, one might be very suspect to that. Why are you asking me to report on those of my colleagues? But in a classroom, we think it's fine. So we take the relatively disempowered space in order to do these studies. But in doing so, we produce relations that make us think that we are looking above, down onto, when in fact, my goal has often been to invert that, to flip it. And so I'll end with just a little anecdote here. When the Facebook API was turned off in 2015, and I've worked with these people. I went to school with them. They're my cohort. They're my friends. The next conference I was at was ICWSM, International Conference of Web and Social Media, in 2015, and I remember talking to Eitan Bakshi. Now, Eitan Bakshi wrote an article with Lada Adamich, which kind of kickstarted the question of whether Facebook is nudging people towards certain political left or right. I also kind of had an awkward hand in nudging that paper, but the important thing is that both Eitan and Lada said to me, Bernie, I feel really bad about your work, and we'd like to help. If you would like to do these sorts of studies, we can come up with something at Facebook where you can come here, we can render them with people and talk about them. And I said, you guys are missing the point. If I can't get people to see their own networks as part of everyday life, then I'm just doing your market research for you. It doesn't matter if a user in a user UX study can see it, if that's not something that a person can see themselves. I don't want to go to Facebook and look at other people's networks. I want people to be able to look at their own. I want people to be able to see what they can see and act on it, whether it's comfortable or not. And that to me, so I didn't. I stopped working on Facebook data, and I stopped working with them because they had a different notion of who gets to see and how they get to see than I did. And mine was informed by a sense of trying to provide agency to people, particularly in the classroom, and how to perceive this as a form of social cohesion and not just as a way in which we sort of intervene on a social system as if from above. And so with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions or open a discussion on that.
Thank you so much, Bernie. That was such a fascinating talk. And I'm sure I'm not alone if you have a podcast, I think everyone would love to listen to you because you unpack this such a complicated thing layer by layer in such an interactive way that, yeah, if that's a project that you would consider.
Funny you mention that. I was Oxford's first podcast in Oxford Science, and in 2009, it was the most listened to podcast for May, June, and July on this very issue. Well, on what I thought of was this issue back in 2009, although my thoughts had, but I haven't done anything like that since. So thank you for that encouragement. I'll keep that in mind.
And we also want to be respectful of your time, and I know we only blocked an hour, so now for the Q&A session, if people have questions, please use the hand raise function, and as a moderator, I would collect all the questions, and perhaps Bernie, you can respond to them all together.
This is my last appointment for a while, so I can stretch it for another few minutes. But if you want to leave, I won't be upset. I don't mind. I understand everyone has obligations.
Thank you so much. Okay, great. Sagarika?
Thank you, Dr. Hogan. It was great. It was very fascinating to see the other side of the story. So I think that was fun. I was just thinking of its application in classrooms. So, in the sense that, say, we ask students to fill it in, one, just the physical act of doing it, even if the results are not revealed to them, but just the physical act of doing it might show you how isolated you are from your classmates. And that psychological aspect, I mean, though I understand as a teacher it might help me to figure out where should I place students and what groups aren't interacting with each other. What do you think about the student during the process of filling, the feelings that come with it? And secondly, in terms of power, just who gets access to it at the end of it? So if we do give it to the teacher, doesn't that again reinforce a power dynamic within the classroom, which is already kind of skewed with between the teacher and the student?
Uh, Sure, it does. And to a limited extent, it's necessary by nature of the class. Now, this is one where I have information where I want to impart to a student. The relation is not purely bidirectional in that regard. I think it's important for me to acknowledge that and try to diffuse that relation rather than to eliminate it. And one of the ways that I've done that in the most recent version of my networks class is I said, we're going to look at this network at the beginning of class, and I want you guys to think about how we can make that dense by the end of class. I want to see, can we do this again later? And if we did it later, was it going to be more cross-cutting ties? Is there going to be more density? And we did, and there was. And so to that end, it became an intervention that was active, where I said, I want everyone to think about this. And I even gave people an assignment. I said, I want you to talk about networks with someone you're not connected to in this graph. Let's look at this graph, see someone you're not connected to, go ask them a question. And so that was a deliberate way in which I enacted the logic of small worlds, which is what we talked about in the class, but doing so from an agentic point of view with the students.
While we're waiting on a question, I'm going to sneak a question of my own in here. You mentioned curation of these kind of power, and we were discussing a couple of weeks ago about how with the pandemic and this shift to online learning, suddenly there's another player into the space of learning, which is tech companies, and they tend to be private companies. And this kind of power negotiation between these companies who ended up having a lot more data than teachers or school have of students. And the school, the teachers, the students, the parents, do you have any kind of, what do you think is the role schools are playing in relations to all of this? Because I guess, it's just such a big ecosystem that,
Okay, so I'll drop a couple bombshells on you for this one. The first is when you're talking about algorithmic curation, that was me. That's my article. I came up with that. So yes, I have lots to say. So if you look on my Google Scholar, the most cited work of mine is Distinguishing Performances and Exhibitions, where I try to create a discursive space for a curator. And people are like, that's not curation online, it's curation's in a museum. And I'm like, I'm not sure. And then, lo and behold, later on, everyone uses the term. And so that's it. One of the things about that curation is that it kind of fosters a lowest common denominator culture. And that's one thing we want to avoid. With respect to the curation of data about an individual from the classroom versus, say, from a social media company, I have another paper, not so well cited, but it's nice. It's well cited. It's the PhD work of a Serbian lady named Danica Radovanovic, and it's in New Media and Society. And there we looked at how teachers, professors in Serbia treated Facebook in the classroom, and that they often resisted it as thinking of it as something that delegitimized their power, and that the students had more power over how to use Facebook than they did. So they resisted the use of Facebook because they thought it would usurp their power. Now, in the end, neither of those two, the student or the teacher, thought about the power of the algorithm to kind of steer in one way or the other. So that remains a bit of an open question. I really like the use of courseware where possible, because I like the voluntary role-based approach where you can sign up to these things and participate and keep it separate from your everyday life. I actually am not trying to promote Facebook in the classroom. In fact, quite the opposite of that. The sort of theoretical paradigm I'm working with for my latest book is one in which we think of the details that we give out, the things that we tell other people, as being more democratic, and the things that we give off, the things that are surveyed or sensed of us, being more authoritarian. And so politically, we can think of, are we trying to create a space to maximize identity being features that a person voluntarily gives out? Or are we trying to lean on spaces that are using information about a person that is incidental, that they may have given off, but may not have wanted to give out? Things like, so most recently, as an example, this past week, Microsoft has said they are no longer going to be doing emotion detection with their face detection. That's a crude example of how something we give off can be outside of our control, and that the algorithms can then manipulate that. So I want, I don't know beyond that, except to say that I want to think of the classroom as a social construction that doesn't necessarily need to be a physical space, but as a space of relations, and that, you know, specific software can be used to think about, in an almost utopian way, what relations do we want to produce, rather than just leaning on what digital technologies are necessarily available.
Thank you for that. Now?
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I've had
Have you ever seen me present this, Niall?
some Teams issues. Really interesting, Bernie, thanks. Just a couple of reflections from you. One was on the data generated from your network app versus the kind of data coming in from Facebook, because I guess the way in which that's constructed and the process by which that happens is different. And the second point was, you really like your point of marginalization, and I was just trying to flip that another way. So if someone is seeing themselves as an outlier in a network, do they understand that as partial? Going back to what you were talking about, as it's only a model of the world, and sort of when that's introduced probably is relevant. I was just thinking an example, if someone's like, I don't know, in an education department, just to take this example, and is an excellent Python programmer, for example, and might be the only person with that skills. So in a particular network, they're a complete outlier, but actually it's not necessarily, they're not necessarily marginalized.
Okay, I got to jump in right on that, because you know what? I was looking for, I did a thing, you might even find it online somehow, but I couldn't find it. I did a project for the University of Oxford for the Knowledge Exchange group. And this was the first thing I did with Josh before even NameGen Web. And what we did is we did a survey. We asked people, who else do you go to for Knowledge Exchange, whenever? And we sent it back to the research services, and then they shared it to the Knowledge Exchange group, and yeah, that happened. People were not happy if they were on the periphery. They're like, I am not a peripheral player. I am just a peripheral, I'm peripheral in this network. And so people then asserted their own sort of centrality in reaction to that. And that was actually the genesis of the idea of this marginalization, was precisely that issue, which made me reflect on, do we need to show people the whole network in order to be functional? And what happens if we don't show them the network? Who has it and doesn't see it? Now, as for the differences in the process, well, you know, when you're doing a network with other people on a small scale, it's voluntary. You have to merge that data yourself. It still can be a bit tricky, but it's a very different process than one that is depending on an API that can limit that data. So for example, now you can still actually get okay, isn't this mind-blowing that Facebook, Snapchat, WhatsApp, Instagram, they all ask for your phone book. They all ask for your address book. They all take that. But you can't populate your address book with the friends from Facebook. They don't give it back to you. That asymmetry is programmatic. And I've wrote a piece called Social Media Giveth, Social Media Taketh Away, to try to talk about how we just don't get APIs. And culturally, because we don't get them, we don't understand how much regulatory power over our ability to see and know our own world is done just through like, this API exists or not. And so part of my own mission is to kind of like educate people, not just in sort of the algorithmic curation, they resort in this direction, but literally, do they expose this data so you can use it or not? And you know, the sad reality is that not getting that data seems to be more par for the course. I guess that's all I'm going to have to say on that for now.
Super, thanks, Brittany.
Claire?
Thanks. That was a fantastic talk. I just had a quick question. Do you think there's any benefits from an education standpoint, and maybe from a socio-political standpoint, of there ever being a benefit to limiting networks and cutting down on the number of networks that one participates in? The language of Facebook and the language of the internet seems to be that the more connections you have, the better. But the quality of those connections is never really discussed, in terms of perhaps sometimes multiplying the number of connections you have can degrade their inherent quality. Do you see maybe there's particularly in education, a potential of there being a pedagogical or political purpose of isolation or social containment within a core network?
Yeah. So I have a small answer to that. A longer answer, you're going to have to ask Liam Bukursky. That's my PhD student with Rebecca Einen, who's now looking at whether people are doing, when getting educational resources, and these are educators. He's a teacher himself, in addition to being my DPhil student, about whether they're seeking resources outside or within their own network, and what are the sort of differences in when we seek it out within the school versus when we like go to Twitter and go, hey, I've made this new lesson plan, check it out. But you pick up on something intuitive that I discovered like 30 minutes before I submitted my thesis as a DPhil student. and that is my PhD was on how people connect with others in everyday life. I was using data from 2004, 2005, so it's just at the beginning of this sort of digital revolution. And what we found, say we, it's my thesis, but no, I was part of a large research group, so I'll say we. So what we found was what I've termed the paradox of convenience. And the paradox of convenience is that people will adopt a new medium because they assert its convenience on one feature. But as you divide your time across the multitude of media, it becomes harder for me to know what's the right medium to get you. Everyone knows someone who just is an email black hole, but then you go to the office and then they can talk your ear off for half an hour, or somebody who seems to be always on Twitter but is never, at the meeting. People have preferences for different media, and the more media we have, the harder it is to establish the right sort of channels. So in addition to the signal to noise ratio-ness that comes from just like kind of restricting your ties to think of quality over quantity, is also the matter of just accessibility. And are we polluting or undermining accessibility? That's also for me a reaction against another lovely theorist who had the same supervisor as me and in education. This is Caroline Haythornthwaite. And Caroline had this notion of media multiplexity, which is the idea that students were closer to those that they used multiple media with. Now, I talked about multi-strandedness as like different roles. You got different roles, you're closer, but also what if you used a lot of different media? But while that is the case, it also indicates that it's just harder. It becomes increasingly harder to know the right way to get people. And so I think that one way that we can sort of overcome this is to establish very declarative norms, either within the group or for yourself, about things like no email Fridays, or, I am responsive by this. So I tell my students, please message me my Teams if you want response within a day. Email, you might get it, but I do email in batches, whereas I respond to Teams almost 24/7. And so I was being explicit about my media preferences because the students wouldn't necessarily know which one it is. And as we add more things onto our courseware, like Canvas got like discussions and assignments and groups, and it's overwhelming. We have to restrict that just so we know people know the right way to access.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you.
If anyone have any questions, now it's your last chance to ask them.
In the session, you can also email me or get me on Teams. You know where I am on Teams. I'm right here.
But thank you so much, Bernie, for giving us this amazing talk. This is just a plug for our session next week, which is with Dr. Kristen DeSorbo, who's the Chief Learning Officer at Khan Academy, where she'll be discussing teaching, continue the discussion in classrooms, but slightly different, teacher in the loop, how to integrate teachers into learner analytics. So we hope to see you then. But until then, thank you again, Dr. Hogan, for giving us the talk and sharing your insights. And yeah, now do you have any concluding thoughts?
No, just to say thanks again, Bernie, for a great talk, and feel free to join us if you have time for the session next week as well.
Yeah, that sounds like a cool
Looks
topic.
like an interesting one. Great,
Yeah.
and thanks everyone for coming, and I look forward to seeing you on Wednesday. Great. See everyone. Bye bye. Bye bye.